Excellencies, colleagues and friends. We all know and agree that trying to improve and optimize the development impact of migration is a huge task. Remittances is only one part of it, and even on remittances there are very many dimensions to how it can be used to improve its development impact. Today I'll be speaking with you about one very narrow part of remittances, and perhaps not the even most interesting part of remittances. I'll be speaking to you about just practically how to reduce the cost, the transfer cost of remittances. I'll be speaking to you about bringing into life SDG target 10C effectively. So we all remember September 2015, SDG 10C says that by 2030, to reduce to less than 3% the transaction cost of migrant remittances and eliminate remittance corridors with costs higher than 5%. Since then, ADEPT and partners have been working on what is our role, what can we do to bring this to life, however small. And we've taken this approach like many other diaspora organizations because our focus is on solutions rather than problems. That's the first part. And secondly, we're far more interested in practicalities, operations, and actuality rather than broad policy. So this is where we're coming from. And to explain the Nairobi Declaration or the Nairobi Action Plan on remittances, perhaps I would use timelines to discuss it, timelines from September or maybe from July last year to now, and then timelines of from now onwards, how us in this room can develop partnerships to bring this action plan into reality. As early as December 2014, when the UN Secretary General published his synthesis report, which started the negotiations for the SDGs, myself and colleagues from the World Bank were key opponents of what ended up being Target 10C. And our opposition was that 3% was not good enough. Because by December 2014, I remember in New York, I was speaking to colleagues there, and I told them I can go right out in the street and get 1%. So why should we be making the world stick to 3%? That sort of 1% advocacy went on through the negotiations, but formally what ended up being 10C was finally agreed at the Addis Ababa at the Financing for Development Conference, which gave us the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. By that time, my colleagues at the World Bank had given up because they know it's going to be 3%. I knew it was going to be 3%, but I didn't give up. I made a nuisance of myself in Addis Ababa by annoying finance ministers up to the last minute. They were worried about taxation and illicit transfers, and I was telling them 1%. The reason why I was making that point was because I knew that in November of 2017, there would be the Valletta Summit between Europe and Africa. And we wanted to see whether what we couldn't get in SDGs, whether we can get it for Europe and Africa. And indeed, that's what happened after July, working with the leadership of the African Union. Two of them are here in this room, both the commissioner and the director. On the Europe-Africa Valletta Summit, we managed to get in that action plan not only the reaffirmation of 10C, the 3%, but also a line that says that between Europe and Africa, they would identify corridors for remittance transfer where partners commit to substantially reduce cost by 2020. So at Valletta, we brought in a new timeline, 2020, not 2030. So that was November of 2015. So what we at ADEP did from November 2015 for 3 to 4 months was to try to translate that into reality. So we came up with a formulation of what about then in Africa, get the 3% target by 2020. And we worked on that program by July of last year. Sorry, by July of this year, we had got a good, firm idea of what it was. And at the P2P meeting in July this year in Brussels, I was honored to be a guest speaker there. I took the opportunity to introduce the idea of 3% by 2020. And on June 28th, here in Nairobi, we then agreed the Nairobi Action Plan on Remittances, which says that ADEPT, AIR, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya, and other partners who have now joined us will seek to support 10 African countries for them to reduce the cost of remittances to 3% or less by 2020. And this is what the action plan is all about. Since July, from July to September, what we've done at ADEPT is develop the detailed specifications of what sort of technical intervention would allow us to achieve that 3% in 10 countries. We have also gone round to find other partners, international agencies and development institutions, to be part of that delivery mechanism. Many of them, all we're asking from them is technical support, moral endorsement, and in some cases we've also got the financing or part of the financing to allow us to make this intervention. In September, as you all know, September 19th was the UN Summit on Refugees and Migration. At that point, I happened to be speak at Roundtable 3, which was international cooperation, the way ahead. And most of my presentation was to reinforce what all of us are agreeing here, that within the SDG era, we are really in the era of implementation. I think most of us are quite exhausted, tired, and perhaps getting even agitated about repeating principles and frameworks and policies. All we want now, as colleagues have said earlier today, is to bring it to life for the individual migrants and diaspora and all the families they support across the world. So that practical focus, in fact, one of the lines I use at the UN is, I am now feeling over-principled but underperforming. And the whole world is over-principled and underperforming. And we should be very worried about that. But I'm pleased that here in this room, we're keen on the implementation. We hope that from now, October to December, we would finalize memoranda of understanding and partnerships with different organizations, hoping that in the fourth quarter of 2017, we would start the implementation. Now, can I just take a few minutes to give a little bit of background as how we see this implementation, how we think we would achieve this 3% by 2020. I am not even worried as to whether we would succeed in all 10 of them. I am just interested that we will succeed in more than 5 of them. Because in the era of implementation, it's about doing things practically, and as someone said, I think it was Leon, having an appetite for even a bit of failure, as long as it's about doing things practically and in reality. The implementation of the action plan would be based on 3 R's: review, reform, and reduce. So for each of these countries, there would be a review. I will not go into the details of the review, but a review to know in substance and in reality what are the circumstances, the facts and figures, beyond just what we get on the report, because as we know, all of the former reports include a lot of calibration and returning to the mean, as it were. So we would go in more detail for each country as part of the review. The reform would be rectification and bringing new policies and practice. And the last part is the action itself of reducing the cost. We think that the intensive work will happen in 2017-18, so that you allow another year or so for it to bear fruit, as it were. The 10 countries we're working, Amadou here is already working on that. Many countries have expressed interest in being part of that 10. We would want, as part of criteria, to select 10 that represent the 5 regions of Africa, if possible. If it's not possible, we'll go with what we have, but we would want that geographical and regional representation. We would also look for countries whose current average rate in terms of cost of remittances is perhaps between 9 and 10%. I say that because we need to bring it down. We have to make significant achievement, but I also don't necessarily want to take as the core 10 ones that are so difficult that we won't be able to do it. So after the 10, we may have the resources to do maybe another 5 outliers, which would help us look at the extreme cases, as it were. But we would take a group of countries that we are sure that we will be able to make a difference. Because what's the payout of doing this? The payout is, as we've heard earlier, every percentage point in cost, that is both direct and indirect costs, not that you make, you are releasing millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into households and communities. That payout alone, that payoff, that result, that profit alone is worth the effort. What is it are we looking for those African countries, those 10, to be able to work with them? We're looking for commitment. We are not looking to convince any country to be a part of it, because it won't work. We're in 2016 within SDGs. We cannot be doing the convincing. It has to be countries that are convinced, that are already working on it, and they are committed to this. Our indication of what commitment means, I would just highlight a few of them. And some of the countries that have expressed interest are already in that fold. Number one, the political endorsement, either by the finance minister or even the head of state, but we will not be working with the minister or the head of state. It's just the political endorsement. But a national lead in each country by the governor of the central bank. Again, we won't work day to day with the governor of the central bank, but they are the national lead. They would own it. They would be the one effectively responsible for delivering 3% by 2020 with our support, technical support. Within the central bank, we're looking for an operational lead there, a manager at the central bank, a manager. That is the person we would work with on a day-to-day basis. And that operational lead is part of a national operational team. That would involve, we are happy with mid-level managers, and perhaps in the program, even junior professionals, because we're interested in the idea of getting a pipeline of young African professional civil servants involving in delivering tangible results. And part of the reason why we are also very partial to getting middle management is because, as we know, in all technical support programs, when you're working with senior civil servants, it's very difficult. They are very busy, they are overworked, and many times they are moved around. And for this, the part of commitment we're looking for, it's a relatively short period of time. There's no fussing about. There's nothing extraordinarily difficult for us to understand. It's just a matter of boring operations and getting it done. So that is the level that we are in. So that's roughly the criteria we're looking at, and the team would include, as I said, mid-managers and even junior professionals from Central Bank, Ministry of Finance, the National Statistics Office, perhaps the agency that promotes inward investment, and also migrant and diaspora advocates would be in that team working with the consultant, the action plan consultants. Last comment I would make about this Nairobi Action Plan on remittances is, in our estimation so far, we think that the intervention would be made up of 4 main types of activities. The first part, of course, is legislation and regulatory reform. We think that this would actually constitute just about 10% of the intervention, because in many cases, you don't need any primary legislation. The primary legislation is okay. At legislation, you might need secondary legislation. You may need significant reform of the regulatory policies, but for that there's a lot of best practices across the world. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. You can borrow something that works, customize it, localize it, make it work. So regulation and legislation we think is 10%. Another part which is far more important we think is regulatory practice. Because in many cases you have the regulatory framework, but the practice in reality is quite different from the policy. And we think that constitutes about 20% of the intervention we would make. The third intervention, again we think it's about 20%, would be the remittance market facilitation. As almost all of us know, the bottom line in making this change is to have a vibrant, competitive, fair, and ethical remittance market. As part of the work, we would look at the top 15 countries in the world where remittances are cheapest and try to do, in a reductionist analysis point of view, what is it that works there. And we would also look at the 10 MTO countries in the world that charge the cheapest and see how that can work in our 10 countries. But lastly, we think 50% of the intervention is all about market stimulation, market ethics, competition, innovation, and entrenching. It's about getting good players, good MTO players, coming into these markets, operating fairly into the market, and remaining in the market they're operating. That ultimately is how you would get costs reduced, and then you entrench this approach and monitor it beyond even 2017. Thank you very much.
Gibril, thank you very much.